And this week we've got hopefully a really cool seminar from the Dauers, Jenny and Joe. And they're going to talk about their faculty development leave in the Netherlands. And I think they're going to talk a bit about the research that they did, as well as hopefully give some of the faculty that are here, including myself, maybe some perspective on how to go about doing it. Certainly something I'm looking forward to. And of course, we don't call it sabbatical here at UNL. I think the word sabbatical is unsavory to some folks because, God forbid, we should do productive research, get NSF grants, and make important international contacts. So anyway, I'll let Joe and Jenny take over.
All right. Okay. So Jenny and I, we do science education research, and within the field of education research, we think of ourselves as very different, doing different things. But many people would say, kind of lump us under the science education realm. My work tends to be focused more on, well, we both focus on how students learn, but in different ways. So I'm really interested in how students create models, how they use math and biology. Jenny is working more on decision-making and socioscientific issues. And so it was a challenge to find a place where we could do a faculty development leave that we could both kind of fit under that same umbrella. But we seem to have struck gold. I just realized metaphorically as well, but it is gold symbol there. Anyways, at Utrecht University, which yeah, turned out really well. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the work we've done there, and then I'm going to pass it over. Jenny will talk more about what she did, and then at the end we have kind of like the third is going to be about kind of the logistics of it. Oops. All right, so of course we had a lot of fun and we had a lot of photographic moments there. But in fact, there was a lot of times that we were doing a lot of learning at the same time. The Netherlands does informal education and outdoor education really well. And so there was times we were visiting museums and other things that we were learning an incredible amount about the country, even though we weren't, you know, it was kind of fun at the same time. And we were learning a lot of things that are related to things at IANR. So we were learning about how they have moved water a lot. So we were doing a lot of learning about biosystems engineering. So they use the windmills to move water. As you probably know, the Netherlands lies below the sea level. And so how they've engineered to move the water to the places they want, and then even recaptured land. So there's a whole province of the Netherlands that was underwater about 50 years ago. And they blocked off part of the inland sea and created new land. So that's there's quite a large area that is brand new land and arable, so they're farming that. We learned a lot about this picture. Of course, we learned about bikes, but we also learned about the water that is in a lot of the canals. There's a lot of concern about nitrogen levels. Nitrogen in the water, the drinking water, nitrogen that's coming from farms. There's a lot of discussion about how people are farming there. It is the most densely populated country in Europe, and therefore there's a lot of runoff from those cows that's impacting those people that are not farmers. And so there's a lot of dissent that's going on. There were farmer protests, things like that, about how to regulate the water and the nitrogen in the water. We also learned some horticulture, how they cultivate tulips, and we learned about art, because they have fantastic art that takes in nature things. And then, of course, there's cheese, which I'm not sure how that's connected to IANR, but it's just they have a lot of cheese and it's good. So yeah, we like cheese. So that was good. But we also, on the serious side of things, we did do a lot of research and work My focus when I was going was to think about interdisciplinary teaching and learning. So I do a lot of biology, math work here and biology, physics. And so I was very interested in how they were teaching and doing research on this and on interdisciplinary learning. I also wanted to use the time to reflect on my teaching that I do and think about how I could be doing that better. And then, of course, one of the main goals for Faculty Development Fellowship is to network, find collaborators, find people to work with, and to reach out and make these kind of foundational, established foundational collaborations to build from. And so I was able to accomplish all these goals, but they didn't look the way I thought they would at the beginning. So things definitely changed over time. I was able to do research on interdisciplinary teaching and learning. So they do, a lot of people give lip service to interdisciplinary teaching, or it's in the goals for the university, or we're going to do interdisciplinary work. But Utrecht, and I think a number of these universities in the Netherlands, actually make it a core part of their curriculum. So they have courses that are interdisciplinary courses, and it's not like you would think of as, okay, so you pull in biology and chemistry and you kind of think about biochemistry. No, this was where you're really focused on moving beyond your discipline and beyond thinking about two disciplines and actually thinking about how you could solve problems from an interdisciplinary lens. So how do I understand culture? How do I understand, I'm just trying to think, like economics, different things related to biology for these. So for these students, that was really important that they would spend that time to do that. So that was where the research for me took place, was we were working in these interdisciplinary courses, observing the courses, and being involved in their what they were writing, analyzing what they were writing and what they were producing, and then thinking about how students progress from this disciplinary to a multidisciplinary, thinking about a couple different disciplines, to actually interdisciplinary, where you kind of have an epiphany that you need to actually use these other disciplines to understand these problems. And so for some students, they aren't getting to that point. These are majors courses, but they're also non-major courses. So we were really focused on trying to develop that understanding of interdisciplinary learning. I also, before I went, used this the opportunity to write for this the supplemental funding through NSF. So if you have an NSF grant, this opportunity is available for collaboration with European researchers through as long as they have a European Research Committee grant. So I was able to find this individual, Nathan Favre. So you basically, you look through this enormous PDF file of all these, anything that the ERC funds, and you just see if there's anything that's related to what you do. And so Nathan actually does work on how people who have had brain injuries or things like strokes, how they develop their metacognition after those injuries. And which is very unrelated to what I do with students learning. But we realized that he does a lot of work on neurobiology. I'm very interested. I have a grant in neurobiology, in cognitive neuroscience, so that maybe if he was interested enough in the educational side and I'm interested enough in the metacognition, metacognitive training, that we would have some opportunity to overlap. And in fact, since then, we have developed this collaboration. So here's just an example, the protocol that we're using. We've been thinking about how do you take students in our classrooms and you start to train them to be more aware of what they know and what they are confident that they know, and can you change that over time in order to improve their learning? So we are starting our data collection next week. So this was a collaboration that started quite a long time ago with him when I was over there in the Netherlands, was able to visit him, and then has built over time. And so networking that has kind of translated into additional research from there. And lastly, but definitely not least, is this work on the impacts of this faculty development fellowship on my teaching. It did provide a lot of space to think about how I teach. And one of the things was to bring in that interdisciplinary teaching and learning into the classroom. So I've started doing that. I've started bringing in some of these things, having students think about metaphorical thinking, kind of thinking outside of your discipline, also applying some of these biological mechanisms like evolution to alternative fields, thinking about how that would work or not work, and as a way of learning the biology. And then I also had the time and was kind of had a reading club, I guess, reading, yeah, well, it wasn't really a club, there was 2 of us, but me and another instructor there. And we read this book together, this Grading for Equity book. This is really, it kind of changed how I was thinking about teaching. It made me think about how we disadvantage some students in our classrooms through our grading approaches. And I changed my teaching philosophy based on this book. I've started using this mastery grading in my classes, and it's really changed how I think about, that instructor-student interface and what's happening at that interface. So those were, that's pretty much some basics about what I did there without going into too many details and eating into Jenny's time too much. If there are questions, this is us on, so Koningsdag is their celebration every year of the birthday of the king. And everyone dresses in orange. Literally everyone is dressed in orange. And they have gigantic flea markets. Anyone can sell anything you want. And there are people, they'll go to the store and buy a bag of something and they'll sell it. Or there was a person that you could give money and they would put a hot dog on top of a little slide and then it would just slide off. And that's what you just paid them 50 cents and you could watch a hot dog shoot off. I mean, I don't know. It was just like the craziest thing ever. Plus you could buy all sorts of whatever, someone's broken shoe and, you know, it was anything went. Yep. All right. Do you have any questions about my stuff before I turn it over to Jenny? No? Riveting. I should have brought cheese. I really. Larkin, if you can hear me, bring some cheese back. Okay. Do you need this one or you got it? Okay.
Before I talk about my stuff, I just want to brag about Joe a little bit for a second, because I think he's very humble about what he does, but he's really like basically pioneering a whole new field of research. There are very few people that are scanning people's brains with an interest in how they learn and applying that to classroom learning and doing the full spectrum of like what's happening physiologically in your brain and how is that connected to how you learn in a classroom. And it's really novel and new. I think this opportunity to hang out with Nathan and collaborate with people here at UNL too is really going to be an amazing thing for him. And I also wanted to mention too that mastery grading system that he's developed. He's maybe one of maybe 1 or 2 other courses at UNL that is using this system for grading, which is also really cool. And I think he's showing a lot of leadership doing that. So I just wanted to say that he's doing some really cool stuff. So, I wanted to say too, sort of, how we ended up at Utrecht University. Joe mentioned we were looking for people that were similar or of interest for both of us. One of the things that drew us to Utrecht University is that they have a research institute called the Freudenthal Institute, where they do research broadly in science and society, or STEM in society. And that includes science education, but also philosophy of science and science communication. And they're a well-known institute that's been around for like 50 years. Joe and I met, in particular, Christine, here who's a science education researcher who does work that's similar to what Joe and I had interest in when we were at a European conference. And we were also aware of Dauer, who did some work. But then when we got there, of course, because of this great place, there are people that we didn't know before we left, but they ended up being really key for our learning. So I'm going to mention Yella and Ralph here, who are two collaborators that I have now. And also everyone is like a good friend also. But one of the things that also was important for me in terms of going to Europe to do a sabbatical is that generally in the EU, they do science education research a little bit differently or have different areas of emphasis. One of the things that they do really well is thinking about how to help students learn about socioscientific issues, so important societal issues that have components of science embedded in them, and how to train students and prepare students for being engaged in science in a civic capacity. So this document here, the EU Commission or European Commission, talks about citizenship as one of the really important key things, and along with other things as well. And I think there's maybe just a different framework for how people think about that. They also are really leading in terms of sustainability education. This Green Comp is a framework around students learning about sustainability. And also what drew me is there people at Freudenthal Institute like Christine, who I mentioned, had a big grant around open schooling. So open schooling is particularly in a K-12 realm, but it's like trying to get schools to be more open to the community and having real relationships with community partners and members of the community like corporations or agencies, and having a more free-flowing exchange between students and real-world stuff. And that was really appealing to me. One of the things in my own research that I had been getting more and more interested in over time is thinking about, like science education. When we think about science education, we think there's probably multiple goals that we have in terms of, philosophically, what are we doing? One of them is, obviously, we're training people to be scientists. But another goal is also thinking about how do we just train people to be in the world as people and use science in their lives and use science as members of society, and think about how science could be valuable to them personally, for their own empowerment to make change and better their own communities. And so this is something that I had been thinking about for a while, like what is the intersection between these things? And in Science Literacy 101, which is the course that's required for all students on East Campus, all 26 Kasner majors have to take Science Literacy 101, and I'm the lead instructor for that course, so I develop all of the material for it. There are other 4 or 5 other instructors in Kasner that teach it as well, and it's oriented around systems thinking and decision making and information literacy. But recently, as early as I guess 2021 is when we started piloting this idea of having all of these 600 students that take the class every year start doing some kind of experiential learning as part of the course. So already the students had been having to pick a topic that they were really interested in and think about how do we solve a complicated societal topic and how does science play a role in that. They were already doing these long projects. It was like a third of the semester that they were focused on a project like this. But then over these last few years, we're like, okay, now we really want students to do something real world related to this. So students have had to find somebody in the community who is interested in mental health or interested in invasive species or interested in whooping cranes and talk to them and say, so what are you doing related to whooping cranes? Is there anything going on that I can participate in or volunteer for? And they're getting a few hours of experience with something real. And so one of the ways that I had been thinking about this in terms of my research too is this framework that a colleague of mine in Colorado developed a few years ago, and we've been already doing some research on, called Science Civic Engagement Self-Concept. So this idea of like, what do I think I can use my science knowledge and skills for to serve my community? Or how can I use what I know and what I know I can do related to science or what I learned in my classes to do something for the Husker community. And the science civic engagement concept included a sense of confidence that you can use your skills to positively impact your community, having value for using science skills to improve a community issue or whatever, civic action, like an intention to act using science skills, and civic knowledge, knowing how to use science skills to make a difference in your community. And so we think about how classroom learning then might lead to potentially real-world civic action. And then I've been thinking about all these things, and then amazingly, when we get to Utrecht, found out that, or sort of started realizing that their collaborators, especially Jelle, this guy here, is the leader basically in this concept that they've had that they've developed over multiple decades too, of researchers in the Scandinavian area as well. And thinking about this idea of action competence, having students build up their knowledge and willingness and confidence to engage in societal issues, and how education might support people's sense of competence to be engaged. And so that was really great because a lot of the experience that I had in the Netherlands was working with these folks and talking with them about these concepts. And we exchanged papers and gave each other feedback on grant proposals. We're now have been seeing each other's presentations and stuff at a couple different conferences, and keep in touch both personally and professionally. And that's also led to some nice experiences. For example, Jelle and Christine are advisory board members on a grant that I just got that allows us to continue studying this idea in the Science Literacy 101 and to improve the materials within the course, and think about how our instructional strategies might improve science civic engagement, and also provide opportunities for students who don't know how to often navigate these opportunities on a college campus that are outside of a class. You know, potentially get more students interested in research opportunities or volunteer opportunities or other kinds of things. So that's part of what we're doing. And then this year, my buddies there also were awarded a very big grant to look more at action competence, particularly around sustainability, and I'm on their advisory board. So I think a little unfortunately, it's difficult to find pools of money that fund a project that is in the United States and in the EU, other than like supplemental awards and things like that. So for now, that's what we're doing, but I can really see this developing into a long-term collaboration on these areas of interest and collecting similar kinds of data in lots of different contexts in our two locations. And then also was able to collaborate on two manuscripts that are pretty much done, but are in progress still with my buddy Ralph and my buddy Christine. So that's kind of the things. I think the whole sabbatical, in terms of my teaching and research, it really supported both and the integration of both, and definitely provided opportunities to get started in a new area of interest in my research that I wouldn't have had otherwise. So I'm going to pause there for questions for me while you gaze upon our fresh stroopwafel and a pile of cheese. Any questions or thoughts? Then we can move on to the logistical parts of the sabbatical idea. Yeah.
I did have a question, and maybe this. You said that you encountered like outdoor learning, stuff like that, and how instructors in the Netherlands incorporated that into education. Have you seen how some of those kind of outdoor learning concepts could be applied to education here at the university?
That's a great question. So do you want me to, okay, so the question was about what we observed in terms of outdoor learning, and then what did we learn that we could specifically use here at the university? There's probably a lot we could say about that. Some of it was our own experience with our kids who were younger, and just like the kinds of programs that they would have informally at museums and nature centers and things like that. So that was one part of it. But then we also saw through our colleagues the work that they did, particularly focused on sustainability. One of the things that came out of this too that Joe and I are working on is looking at potentially in another year or two a study abroad course that would be focused on sustainability education, in collaboration with TLTE, which is the teacher learning education department on city campus. I'm trying to think of what else we can say. Is there anything else you'd add to that?
I mean, I guess I would say that it is kind of informal. Like, we didn't really study it, like how it just seems more prevalent. And so when it's done at a younger age, by the time they get to the university, I feel like they're not, it's not like the classes are going outside and doing things more often than ours. I mean, they're meeting in classrooms just like ours are, but in a lot of cases. But I feel like it's just expected or something. I don't know. I don't really, it's more of a perception thing than I actually know that. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think they do have really good training for people in informal spaces for museums and things like that. I think some really great programming and expertise. I also think there's some cultural differences too around, I think the hygiene hypothesis, I don't know if you guys have heard of that before, this idea that our immune systems will be stronger if we're exposed to more germs generally. I think that whole idea started in the Netherlands, and I think they also have this culturally are more interested in things being natural. And they also, I think, really believe in contact between people and animals. There are lots of places to do petting zoo kinds of things. Like almost every playground would have animals that you could pet, like goats and stuff. And I think that maybe it's partly, they do a lot of outdoor things. Everyone goes for a walk at lunch. So for a very populated, densely populated place, I think they also have a lot of emphasis on outside and nature and conservation too. Yeah. Okay. Should we do this next part? Oh, another question. Yeah.
Investigating policy, which is used for teaching quality. But I have been dating like that. Really asking, I will hear or look at its paper. So my question is that, like, given the communication and expenses related to carrying of things and everything in the classroom, and like for the people who are like recommended by doctors to go to scan, they find it very difficult to get it both logistically and financially. So what do you see like this research going, like how practical you think it is that scanning details and then applying the applications, those tools in the classroom?
Right. So the question for the online is about the practicality of the brain scanning for teaching and pedagogy, and I think that's a really good question. There's for sure what we're doing is very basic research on learning and metacognition and how people make decisions, what neural pathways are activated when you're making a decision, when you're identifying things, when you are trying to determine whether you know something. And so the application to the classroom is, it's not secondary in nature, but what we're trying to do is really understand that learning process, the mechanisms of learning. And then, so part of where we are being very innovative is thinking about, so some of this training that we're trying to do with students is, can we train students to do certain things in order to see a difference in their brain scans later in the class, in a course or after some instructional things. And so that's where we are trying to connect it to there, but we don't do the teaching and things in the scanner. That's really just trying to get an understanding of what's happening in the brain because of all sorts of limitations associated with the fMRI scanner. But so there's attempts. I mean, part of the reason it's kind of cutting edge is because nobody's tried to pull in using these tasks that are really relevant to the classroom. So we have students looking at a biological model, but that's very different. Most of the work that Nathan does, they look at dots and you have to make a determination. Are there more dots on which side? Or is it blurry? Images are blurry. Are they blurred right or left? They're very basic research kind of questions about, at the neural level, how does learning work? So it is disconnected a bit from this classroom experience, but we try to bring it together in ways that make it more authentic than what's going on in terms of the medical world. They have very particular reasons that they're doing their kind of tasks, but those don't really apply very well to the educational setting. So we're trying to bridge that gap, but that it's definitely an ongoing challenge.
Oh, okay. And then we'll get to you, Rand. Sorry. How do I? Well, my answer can be kind of short. And we can talk about this a little bit too, but I didn't do any teaching there really. But that was we couldn't, yeah. The Fulbright that you could apply to for the Netherlands, and I think it's fairly country specific, would require you to teach. Joe was up for that, so he applied to the Fulbright. He can talk more about that. I did not because I wanted a break from teaching. So I didn't observe any classrooms specifically. Joe did some of that in his thinking about interdisciplinary teaching. But I do think, so, and the people that I was working with were mostly focused on K-12. There are differences, but I think there are also a lot of similarities in the K-12 space, like a lot of focus on content, and a lot of people trying to get people to move beyond just thinking about content. Content's important, but there's other stuff. And then I thought, but I'm not sure about university level teaching.
Yeah, I would say I didn't observe a large number of classes, but the ones I did observe are fairly similar to what we've got. And the difference is, at least the couple that I was sitting in on regularly, there was more emphasis on, so they did a lot more on creativity, like trying to teach creativity or allowing creativity than we seem to have here, so that I would say the rigor felt high at the same time that they were promoting different types of things. So it wasn't just knowledge. It wasn't just you need to know more and more and more things, although they do get tested on knowledge. But what they produced, the products that they were, the writing and the presentations were very high quality and were showing a lot of creativity that we don't seem to emphasize in our teaching here. And we just don't seem to create the space for it.
I know this isn't exactly what you're asking, Shivani, but there's also big cultural differences that I think also relate to art and creativity. For example, the faculty within this institute had a Christmas holiday program where some of the faculty got up and sang and played music, and that was not weird. But for us, I think that would feel really what? Why is John singing? Whatever. But And I noticed that as a trend throughout, there are a lot of respect and interest in poems, poetry, and art and music that I don't feel like is as saturated here in how we think about things, and also a lot more cultural, ceremonial kinds of things, like defenses are very elaborate with, fancy clothes, ceremonial. A full professor, getting full professorship meant you give a long public speech in an ancient cathedral, basically, and there's organ music and, stuff like that that was just really different than here. We're like, maybe I'll wear my nice shirt today, because I have a PhD defense in the conference room. But so some of those things I thought were really interesting, and I think that's part of the different cultural expectation too that I think is throughout. But Rand, you had a question. Awesome. Yeah. Yeah, Rand wants to know about master grading. I think we should do some more conversations as faculty within SNR about it too at some point.
Yeah, I think that that's something I'd love to sit down and talk with you about. I think there are definitely challenges. When I engage with my colleagues, I mean, they question some of the work that, how I'm going about it, but I don't think, I think it's different. And it really, like that book really provides a lot of basis for why I'm doing it, because when you start to think about the traditional grading approaches to our classes, it doesn't allow really to show growth. And now, is mastery the solution? I don't know, but it's different. And for me, it just aligns closer to the philosophy I have with teaching. So that's why I feel like I should put it in place. But I do think it's worth, some great conversations about how we approach teaching. And I'm really grateful for this time to actually be able to do that, because it's really hard to do when you're in the moment. When you're in a classroom, you can't be sitting there doubting whether you're doing it right. You need to you just have to go with what you've got. And so to have the space to actually think about teaching is something we really need more of in our university, I think, for people to teach better.
I think that kind of flows nicely into just a few more slides that we have here, but one of them is just talking about what else we gained. If I can get it to, there we go. So, I mean, I think professionally, there was so much that we gained, and some of that was really just time to reflect and catch up on papers. Like, we didn't talk about all the work that we did on other things that we just knew we had to move forward, and had the time to actually finish writing papers and manuscripts and think about grants and stuff like that. But then it was time to reflect on what we really wanted to do with our careers. I think it comes at a nice time for us, and I think in general that you're able to think about, okay, let's be more deliberate about where I want to go and what I want to do, and what questions are worth asking, and what aspects of our job make us the most happy. And that was really helpful to do. And then, of course, there were huge personal benefits. It was a reset and recharge time, and it was an amazing experience for our kids. And we learned a lot in terms of just personal growth, having the opportunity to live somewhere else and experience the culture there. Anything else you wanted to say about that? Okay. So we'll tell you a little bit about what we know about the logistics of doing one of these. And I'll say too, even though there's some weird counterintuitive things about the policies and the rules for how you get it to work, I think there is a fair amount of support for people to, an encouragement to do these opportunities I remember Tiffany Hangmoss saying, not enough people do this and more should, so good for you. And I know that Larkin is very supportive because he has shared his stories also, how he's really benefited from his own opportunities to do this. So I think people, at least locally, will be really helpful in helping you make it work. And jump in at any time here, Joe. Keep talking since I'm up here. So the fellowship is, so you have to have been a faculty member for 6 years, full-time. And then it starts the clock again after you get back. So we're already counting down 4.5 years left. Okay. And so the application, you have to talk about what you're going to do. So there's a formal application process. It's very short. You say what you want to do, say how it relates to your job opportunities, how it's going to benefit you and UNL, and how your responsibilities will be covered. When you get back, you're supposed to report on how you did, but no one's ever asked us, so we haven't done that. Don't tell anybody. And then the rules are, they encourage you to do 12 months or 9 months if you're 9 month. But the rules are, if you do 12 months, it's half pay, or 6 months at full pay. We also learned that you cannot do 9 months with 6 months full pay and 3 months half pay or something like that. None of those shenanigans. It's either 6 or 12. It's also really challenging if you're going to go 12 months half pay to figure out how to pay for it. The Board of Regents policy is that it's you can't use state funds, and you're also not supposed to use your grant funds for your own salary also. So the only exception is really if you use something like a Fulbright, or we had some NSF money that was specifically targeted toward travel. We couldn't use it for our salary, but I had one that was for professional development. For me personally, it was an NSF grant, and then Joe had an NSF supplement award that he mentioned. And so we were able to use those for travel, but not for salary. And so UNL says, go for 12 months, something that will be good for you and for the university, and find some other entity besides the university that will pay for it. So it's kind of, that's a little unintuitive to me. But we were able to make it work for a full year through basically some creative mix of thinking about vacation time and visiting conferences and agreements about where we were going to be when we're doing our work, especially in the summer. A lot of people do work in other places as part of their regular research. So we figured some things out to make it work for a year. And so our advice, should I just keep talking? Okay, our advice is if you're thinking about it, think about how you might fund it, how long you want to go for, skills you might want to develop, and people who you're interested in working with. As I mentioned, Joe and I went to a conference in Bologna, Italy, an education research conference, and one of our explicit aims was to find somebody who was doing stuff that we liked and who was living in an interesting place. And we found Christine and we sat her down and we said, in 3 years, can we come and do a sabbatical at your place? And she's like, who are you? I guess. But we developed a relationship over time and we made it less awkward eventually. And it worked out pretty well. And so that was like in 2019 for a 2022 year that we met Christine. It was as early as 2020 that we talked to John and Tiffany about our plans. I think that was really important thing to do, just let them know what our intentions were. At that point, we started arranging instructors for our courses. The Fulbright is due a year before you want to go, so you have to be aware of that deadline. We also went about a year early just to visit with people and scope things out. That was also especially important for us with the kids. And then it's like the last thing you do is apply actually through UNL for the leave. It's pretty late, yeah. So we kind of had to do all of this work for like 2 or 3 years with the assumption that UNL would be like, okay, which I think it is. They have some language that's like they can only allow like one and only 10 eligible faculty are allowed to go at any given time. But I have no idea how they even figure that out. So I don't know if they enforce that. And I do think a lot of people do not take advantage of the leave. So I think it's usually a rubber stamp kind of thing. And then Utrecht University also did some paperwork to say, yes, you can officially be at our university. They weren't paying us, but they gave us an office space and an ID card. And an email and free coffee, yeah, and access to the botanical gardens that we could do walks in every day, which is great. And then we got all the cheese, lots of cheese. So they say veal kaas, lots of cheese. And that's it. There's some more pictures just because. But yeah, do you guys have any more questions? Cool. Yeah.
So the question was about the 1 in 10 thing. And so my understanding is, so you've been here 6 years, so you're eligible. So you in that there's, or you haven't taken a faculty development leave within the last 6 years, so you're eligible. But so you're one of those 10. So you count up all the faculty that are in that pool, and only 1/10 of them can be gone at one time. That's kind of the thinking. But we've never heard of anyone getting rejected on that front or anything like that, because people don't take advantage of it. I mean, like, even within our department, that's like, you probably have, I don't know, 30 or 40 people that are eligible faculty. I don't know. Larkin could probably tell us, but. Right. And yeah, so.
It's like half of your faculty are like, I'm out next year.
But that's where I think if you talk to the chair and the dean early, and basically we had told them so many years in advance, like, we're going, right? And we'll turn this in the first day it's possible to turn it in and make sure we get that check mark. And I think, I don't know how many apply, but I don't think it's that many. And then but you've basically set up the expectation that you're going. Right. Yeah, that would have been, we had invested, well, we had to do all sorts of things, down payments on the school and the house and all these kinds of things to kind of figure before that even was due. And so you're like, well, we were trying to figure out, like, can we apply early? And they said, no, you can't apply early. Like, well, okay, I guess I just put down these thousands of dollars and hope. So, and it's fine, but you just. Yeah, the salary is really tricky. Well, I think that would be, when we've talked about the next time we do it, that's just the expectation. We're just not even going to, because we tried salary savings, we tried thinking about our grants and all those things, and all that, like, we learned over time is like, nope, you can't do that, any of those things. So.
Yeah, I don't know about that half salary thing. Just kidding. But I do think that we could, if you go to a country that's less expensive, you could maybe swing something like that for a year. But I also think that people locally are supportive enough that it did work out to negotiate on some things. Like, teaching release. We were officially gone for 6 months. But we were also able to get out of teaching for 2 semesters. But I think part of that was, Larkin and, well, it was John at the time, and Tiffany knew that we had been planning this for a really long time and that we were doing all the due diligence that we could to make sure classes were covered and stuff like that. I get the sense that Larkin really wants people to go, and if you need to be paid out for 12 months, I think he would probably help you negotiate something or navigate something. It's my guess. I'm speaking for him and he can hear me, which makes me nervous, but maybe he's had a lot of beers by now, so he's probably like, sure.
Go.
But yeah. But I think the rules seem to be set up for the lowest common denominator kind of a situation, but I think people who know us know we're not going to go for a year and just goof off. Like, we are going to go and support our own careers and our own advancement. Like, we want to go not just because we want to like get out of stuff, but we want to go because we want to be able to focus on things we haven't been able to in a while, and to recharge and
eat cheese.
And eat cheese. So, yeah. Should we call it quits? Yeah.
Yeah, I think that, so finding the teaching replacement, or what goes on with the teaching expectation, I think is through a lot of communication with the people, the brass, about what that looks like. And so providing suggestions for how to do that, or I mean, I think technically, like, you could put in your application and be gone for a full year and just be like, just drop the ball and be like, good luck, you can find somebody to replace me. But I don't think burning bridges is probably the way you want to do it. So, I mean, I think if you start early and you start talking about it and you make suggestions and maybe you teach somebody. I mean, before I went, I taught an extra course for somebody, and knowing that they were going to cover my section the following year. So it was just, there's nothing on the book about what we were doing, or what I was doing there, but it was just kind of like that was the expectation.
Yeah, and I'd say every context is really different too. I had a postdoc who was queued up to teach. And then we also, in the class, the SCIL 101 class, we had enough instructors to cover that year. It was just kind of like there are already people on the books. It's different if you have one class that only you teach, but you might have someone on your team that wants teaching experience or something like that. But then we co-teach a undergrad course, a 1-credit course in the spring. And we had been doing it remote during the pandemic. And we were like, well, we could do it remote while we're there. And the response we got back was, no, you're not supposed to be teaching. And we're like, really? We just offered to teach class. And they said no. So, it might be that some classes are canceled the year that you're gone, or the semester that you're gone. So I think it really depends on the situation.